Here we meet our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, the god of war who defeated Bars, the owner of the Tower of Destruction Tower, and prevented the destruction of the world. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, who should have died at the very moment the Tower of Destruction collapsed, was reincarnated as Kim Hyun-oh, a 17-year-old boy, 300 years later. Meanwhile, our protagonist discovered that the constellations that were created when he was not in that world are his disciples from 1300 years ago, and goes to look for them. Well, it starts at one of the top 3 hunting institutions. The institution was known as Valhalla, and every year countless hunters applied so that they could bear the name Valhalla on their sword. With an admission rate of 500 entering and 1 remaining, that one person was able to graduate with the name Valhalla. Can you imagine if it wasn't even 150 people who could stay? Only 1 out of 500 people. Well, the competition started right from the orientation given to those who entered. And I am not lying. Once in the facilities of that institution, cubicles were prepared for those who wanted to stay in that institution to start fighting. They faced each other one-on-one. While that was happening, the instructor of the Valhalla institution, Lee Sang-cheol, who was the most compact instructor of the highest rank of Valhalla, was watching them all from his balcony, thinking that for sure there were too many people fighting in those cubicles wanting to get in. Thinking that, Lee Sang-cheol, who was the most compact senior instructor of Valhalla, but now we will call the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, realized that the successor of the Yushin family, Yu Min-jun, was entering his balcony. It was there that the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, turned to see him to let him know that there were many people forced to enter the selection process, and asked him if he was there so that he could see his niece. Min-jun with a smile leaned on the balcony railing to reply to the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, that in his family, the Yushin expected a lot from Soyeon, who was Min-jun's niece. At that time, the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, thought of Yu Soyeon. She was a genius, born into the Yushin family, which was one of the top 5 families in South Korea. Soyeon was able to handle mana comparable to that of a 10-year-old schoolgirl. She was also able to add mana to her sword at the age of 13. By the age of 16, Soyeon had competed against members of the Yushin family and excelled. When the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, told Min-jun all this, he added that this was all that was in Soyeon's personnel file, and asked if there was anything else about her that our old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, did not know. Min-jun gave the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, a smile, and then told him seriously that his niece was said to have been able to communicate with the guardian constellation of the Yushin family. As Min-jun said that, our old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, almost fainted. Yet he asked Min-jun if he was really telling the truth, to which he replied that he was obviously telling the truth since that was why he expected so much from his niece. You see, the reason Korea had its top 5 families was because of a guardian constellation attached to each one. Normally, a hunter would receive blessings or some form of a contract with a guardian constellation. However, the guardian constellation of those 5 families was very different from the other common constellations. The one of the Yushin family was the god of the sword. The one of the Jangsan family was the saint of the spear. The one of the Chajin family was the king of Tao. The one of the Ashun family was the first king. And the one of the Dajung family was the god of the bow. The members of those 5 families had been given blessings from their respective constellations, and were also granted more talents and abilities than the others. Thinking about it all, the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, even thought that there was a huge difference between just having received a blessing and being able to communicate directly, since communicating with a guardian god was to be able to form a direct deal with them. Even so, the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, after thinking it all over, let Min-jun know that if that was the case, then his niece was definitely a genius. Min-jun smiled at him again and nodded. After that, Min-jun asked the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, how his niece was doing, which the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, replied that she had not started yet. But after remembering that, he let Min-jun know that his niece was 30 seconds away from starting her admission. There, Min-jun asked him if he could let him watch, to which the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, replied that if he really wanted to see his niece, he could come down from that balcony to watch her for himself. Laughing, Minjun asked the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sangcheol, if he was really asking him to come down to go through a bunch of reporters and recruiters. How the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sangcheol, did not answer him. Minjun asked him that he just had to display a screen on that balcony. But although the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sangcheol, denied it for a few seconds, he agreed later as he was also quite curious. That said, a small screen appeared from the balcony where the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sangcheol, began to set up an even bigger screen, revealing Minjun's niece. Minjun was excited to see that it was Soyin's turn, so he kept silent. As we switched from the screen to the actual scene where Soyin, eldest daughter of the Yushin family, was about to fight against, at last, our protagonist Kim Ju-hyunk, the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sangcheol noticed and said loudly that they seemed to be very calm. Minjun, wasting no time, let it be known that it was because surely our protagonist knew who she was, therefore, he was giving up as his niece's ability was well known. While Soyin, a girl with pink eyes, long black hair and a sword in her hand, was looking at our protagonist with a hateful face, the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sangcheol, looking at Kim Ju-hyunk's face, let Minjun know that our protagonist didn't seem to have any fighting spirit at all. Hearing that, Minjun let it be known with a smile that he was sure the fight would end too quickly. Moving on to the fight scene, as soon as the fight started, Soyin, the girl with pink eyes, long black hair and a sword in her hand, attacked first. Determined to finish the fight, she swung her sword at such a speed that even the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sangcheol, was amazed that she, at such a young age, had such a refined sword intent and ridiculously exceptional mana control. What they did not expect, well, no one expected, was that our protagonist, with a single blow, would leave Soyin, the girl with pink eyes, long black hair, and a sword in her hand, on the floor, thus winning the victory. Quickly, as he put down Soyin, the girl with pink eyes, long black hair and a sword in her hand, our protagonist, without the slightest sense of humility, wondered why everyone was ridiculously weak. He also wondered if this was how it was all 1300 years in the future. Traveling back in time, 1300 years ago in the Tower of Destruction, we met two injured characters, bloodied but eager to continue fighting. One of them was the chief of the Tower of Destruction, the god of destruction Barch. He was more than happy to have such a wonderful fight, while on the other hand our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was thinking that the other was out of his mind. Seconds later, our protagonist, the martial god Kim Hyun-oh, let him know that he didn't like that fight by giving a nice kick in the face to the head of the Tower of Destruction and god of destruction, Barch. Already on the floor, the boss of the Tower of Destruction and god of destruction, Barch, began to laugh like crazy, but leaving him on the floor, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, appeared the notification of some system letting him know that he had finally defeated the boss of the Tower of Destruction and god of destruction, Barch, thus stopping the destruction of the world. While the tower was shaking, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was tired, leaning against a wall thinking out loud that if the Tower of Destruction was being destroyed because he had killed the boss of that tower and god of destruction, Barch. He also added, while basically bleeding out, that he was just taking it easy. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, decided to accept his end. So while the Tower of Destruction was being torn to pieces, he thought about how he had always lived a busy life working as a hunter, even when he was little. Only when he was able to make some money and had gained some recognition did that catastrophe happen. He even wondered if he should have taken all his disciples to that battle. Although later he was glad that he had not taken them with him, since there was one thing undeniable there, and that was the strength of the chief of the Tower of Destruction and god of destruction, Barch. Even if all the disciples of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had been there, all of them would have died like dogs. With nothing else to think about, a giant debris fell on the face of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, crushing his face. When our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, lost full consciousness, seconds later he appeared reincarnated in a 17-year-old body. Although seconds had passed for our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, it had actually been 1300 years after he defeated the chief of the Tower of Destruction and god of destruction, Barch. Anyway, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was very satisfied when he reincarnated. Although his body was weak and young, his knowledge from when he was known as the martial god was more than intact. He hadn't changed much either. When he was reincarnated, he only had a different eye color and was no longer all bloody. For a change. Even so, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, thought that if only he could adapt to that body, he believed he would be able to live a luxurious and pleasurable life. At least before that notification appeared in that translucent window. That window let him know that in 5 years a new tower of destruction would appear, therefore, he had to prepare himself. That's when our protagonist, the flying kicking martial god, Kim Hyun-oh, thought that the gods, or whoever our protagonist, the flying kicking martial god, Kim Hyun-oh, believed in, had some kind of grudge held against him or something. After that, he thought that he should have thrown the head of the Tower of Destruction and God of Destruction, Barch, into the lava when he had the chance. But moments later he took a deep breath and accepted in that he couldn't do anything more even if he regretted it. Moreover, with a smile, he let himself know that this time he would destroy that tower once and for all in order to live his life of luxury and pleasure. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, stopped thinking about those things when that window let him know that he had to reclaim his weapons and memories on the 3rd floor of the 5th room to the right of Valhalla. There, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, went blank because even though he was pretty sure he knew what the window meant by weapons, he did not know what the heck Valhalla was, although he had to find that place called Valhalla. Now in the present, we can return to the Valhalla institution. It was now the 4th day of the top 10 competition, which was starting at that very moment. The people who were waiting to compete were told to go to the competition floor. There, although our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, wondered whether he should go or not, he appeared in the next scene in front of a competitor, I think twice his size. While people were shouting with excitement for our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, and his speaker, the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, began on the balcony. He thought that there were many more people that day than before. He also clarified that this was because the future of the 5 families was in that place. Moreover, everyone was excited about the existence of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh. The old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, thought that his opponent was the eldest son of the Ashun family, 17-year-old Oh Se-hyuk, although he didn't look a bit older. While the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, was still thinking. In the next scene we learn that Oh Se-hyuk thought that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, didn't look like a big deal even if he defeated Sayin, the girl with pink eyes. But still, with a smile, that giant thought that if he defeated our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, his image would increase even more, so without thinking, he caught the attention of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh. When our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, looked at him, Se-hyuk let him know that he was a doctor. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, didn't understand what he was talking about, so he asked him what that abbreviation meant. Se-hyuk, with a smile, replied that it meant that he was going to destroy him fast. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, gave him a smile as well to tell him that Og. When they announced that they could fight, Se-hyuk was confused, so he asked him what the heck was that. That's when our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, showed him his middle finger and told him that it meant to go to hell. In the next chapter we can observe how the eldest son of the Ashun family was not very good in literature, strategy, or martial arts. However, he still had one talent above all others, and that was his physique. He was able to do what other ordinary people could not, unless they used their own mana. And even with just a little training, he was able to become exponentially stronger. The boy had been born with a first-rate physique that required no effort, hence, he was worth being called a genius just for that alone. Therefore, when we return to real time, Se-hyuk, because of what our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had said, was so upset that he launched the first attack. In the remaining seconds of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, thought that with the body he was born with, he would never win a physical fight against Se-hyuk. Although our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, did not know anything else about him, he was very sure that his strength was real. However, just because Se-hyuk was superior in physique did not mean that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, would lose. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, when Se-hyuk threw the first punch, he noticed that the guy had martial arts to back up his body, but after a few dodges on his part, he managed to get the weak point of his opponent. crushing him with a single blow. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, got the victory. Again, with his opponent defeated, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, thought that as long as his body was weaker than his body before his reincarnation, there should be no problem for him to hunt the monsters and be a hunter like before. Concluding his thoughts, he left that room quietly. On the other hand, in another room, there were thousands of recruiters who were stunned at the fight of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh. One of them, dumbfounded, asked aloud if Sayuk had really been knocked down and hit while still not touching the ground, to which one of his companions replied that he really did not expect Sayuk to be knocked down with such a simple attack. While they were talking, behind them was the head of the Ashun family, the first king, Oh Chulshin. Although he was listening to them, also in his head he called them ignorant bastards, for even if his son had never cared to learn martial arts and had only improved his physique, he could easily dodge a fist from anyone who confronted him. But there was something he could not dodge. His son had let his temper take control of him and chased after our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, and used magic that he rarely used to try to end that fight quickly. But our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, managed to dodge his head a little. But since he didn't, he lost. There, the head of the Ashun family, the first king, Oh Chulshin, understood that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had moved faster than his son's speed. And he also thought that from the second his son had entered that room, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had a plan already made. The head of the Ashun family, the first king, Oh Chulshin, praised our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, thinking that his strategy itself was a monstrous talent. But unfortunately for the head of the Ashun family, the first king, Oh Chulshin, there were many recruits who could observe the courage of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, as they were not all ignorant bastards. Still, head of the Ashun family, the first king, Oh Chulshin, thought he was going to get our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, to join his family, whatever it took. Already, in the next scene we can see how thousands of men shouted Nuna to a 17-year-old girl. That, when our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, entered the room, it bothered him a little. But he didn't say anything. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, at last, had entered the qualifiers for the final matches. Now it was him against Choi Arin, who was the second daughter of the Choijin family and was also 17 years old. The two were facing each other, and when the encounter began, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was surprised to see that Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, was waiting for him to make the first attack. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, also thought that she, at least, was trying to read the situation, therefore, she was at least better than the rest. Smiling, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, took the first step, literally took a single step. And there Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, summoned a lightning bolt on her sword, causing everyone around her, be it audience or recruiters, to be surprised, as it was ridiculously strange that a 17-year-old girl could perfect her family's skill-changing element to such a degree. Returning to Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword waited for our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, to take another step before deciding that it was time to make him lose. Unfortunately for her, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was even faster than her sword. So when he appeared next to her and let her know that if she showed him with her eyes when he was going to attack, it would make him easier to dodge, Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, got scared. It was there when our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, struck the first blow. But to his surprise again, Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, managed to dodge it with her sword. For our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, it was no wonder that he didn't even feel that he was hitting a body. On the other hand, Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, was basically trembling a few meters away from our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, as her blow was much heavier and stronger than she had planned. Without seeing it coming, our protagonist, the flying-kicking martial god, Kim Hyun-oh, again went to her side to hit her sword lightly, letting her know if she could dodge that blow as well. Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, understood absolutely nothing until the power of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, came out of his fist, pushing her, making her fall on the floor, fainting. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, upon seeing Arhin on the ground. The girl with the blue and white lightning sword watched her fist to think about her attack, and stance felt strange. But in the end he didn't care since he had won again. When they announced that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, had won that round, they gave the top 10 of Valhalla's admissions. In first place was our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno. In second place was Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, and so on. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, didn't get the news, so when he was walking outside the venue, thousands of reporters, recruiters, and people were all over him, asking him and demanding him to join their teams. There were so many people that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, lost his temper a bit, demanding them all to shut their beaks. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, in the next chapter we can see how he was in the news because after qualifying first place in the admission contest, he chased away all the guilds that were giving him offers while sending them to fry asparagus. Not only was it in the news, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was also all over the internet and even on video channels where users were commenting pretty bad things about our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno. Now, already on the premises of Valhalla High School, the first-year students were being welcomed. Among those several rows was, of course, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, rather bored, in fact. While welcoming them all, they were telling the history of the institution, making our protagonist, the martial flying kicking god, Kim Hyuno, even more bored. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, stopped yawning when he felt a stare on his back. When he turned to look, immediately the guy who was looking at him turned his eyes, basically sweating. There, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, thought about whether he had really excelled the day before more than he planned to do. But he didn't care enough because thanks to his translucent window, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, just needed to get to that room and leave. Moreover, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, had realized one thing. But as soon as he was about to think about it, the entrance ceremony was over, causing our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, to lose his train of thought. Moving on to the scene where we are shown a group in the virtual combat simulation room. There was an instructor wondering why the class layout was the way it was. That instructor was the head instructor of Valhalla of the Choijin Guild, Kim Ligon. Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, noticed that in his class, in front was Soyeon, the girl with pink eyes, long black hair, and a sword in her hand. Next to her was Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword. Behind her was Sayuk. Possibly Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, was losing his sanity since the high command had told him that the classes would be assigned randomly. But he still did not know how it was that 3 of the 5 families were in the same class. Moreover, to Kim Ligon's horror, the chief instructor of Valhalla was our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, almost last. There, Kim Ligon, Valhalla's chief instructor, wondered in a sweat why our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was also in that class. Thinking that, Kim Ligon, Valhalla's chief instructor, told himself that he was, that specific year, doomed to fail. Although he then forced himself to calm down, as in situations like those he needed a strong start. Coughing for attention, Kim Ligon, Valhalla's head instructor, decided to tell his students that it was nice to meet them all since he was the person in charge of that class and also their instructor. He didn't say any more as Kim Ligon, Valhalla's head instructor, had pressed a button on the thing in front of him, transporting all of his students into a forest. His entire class was frightened, except for our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, who was a bit confused but didn't show it at all. Kim Ligon, the head instructor of Valhalla, thought to show them a bit of bloodlust, so he made orcs and goblins appear, which were quite horrible creatures. As everyone panicked, the orcs and goblins continued to advance towards them, but the entire class remained calm as they realized that they had a protective shield. Therefore, those horrible creatures could not lay a finger on them. Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, seeing that the barrier was working perfectly, called our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno. He walked towards Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla. Once there, Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, asked our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, if he could take care of all those monsters on his own. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, let him know yes without flinching a bit. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, smiled at him, thinking that thanks to him, the ego of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, would finally calm down a little, because in that case, most of the students had only seen monsters in books or something like that, but they had never seen monsters in person in their lives. So it was only natural that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, would be scared. But he wanted our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, to stop pretending that he would consider killing all those creatures and just say no. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, let out a laugh, causing Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, to be surprised. However, he let him know if he could seriously take care of all those monsters. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, did not hesitate to answer him again that he could. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, told our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, to go give it a try, while in his head he called him a bragging bastard. Even so, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was not fooled, as he told him that from what he had heard, they were not supposed to be doing that on the first day. Thus, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, watched as Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, was basically giving him a test. Then our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was supposed to win a prize. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, understanding where our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was going, told him that he could add a prize himself. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, took the opportunity to tell him that on the condition that he would take care of all those monsters, what Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, was going to bet on. It was there that Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, let him know that if our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, took care of all those creatures, he would do whatever was in his power. That interested our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, quite a bit, but he still didn't show it. Instead, he let his instructor know that it was not what he expected, but he would still accept that deal. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, upon hearing this, informed our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, that the monsters in that system attacked just like the real ones. But our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, did not care much about that. So he cut their dialogue and asked for the sword, since he was not going to fight without a weapon and much less with empty hands. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, gave him his sword. So our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, came out of that barrier, happy to finish off all those creatures. Once outside, he didn't wait even 10 seconds to pulverize those things. In the next chapter, we still see how our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was cutting heads and bodies in half with a smile, as he thought that it had been over 1300 years since he had used any kind of blade. Thus, he congratulated himself for not doing so badly. At that time, our protagonist, the flying kicking martial god, Kim Hyuno, because of the monsters, thought the world could not do a better role. Plus, he and most people at that time used all kinds of weapons that could be seen. But still, the sword was a familiar enough weapon for him. Thinking of that, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, didn't realize that there was a goblin behind him. But when he noticed it, he easily finished him off, as the patterns of that simulation were quite simple. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was also disappointed by that, as all those creatures seemed to be just NPCs. Thus, he could not enjoy the killing well. While our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was still outside, Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, was watching him from inside, thinking that the only thing he had given to our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was a mere sword, and he was tearing them all apart without any difficulty. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, was also wondering how our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, could cut those bodies so easily with that sword, since it did not contain any magic power or fast swordplay. To Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, it seemed that the sword was absorbing all the monsters. All the students were stunned by what they saw, except Soyeon, the girl with pink eyes, long black hair, and a sword in her hand. She was a little jealous. On the other hand, Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, was amazed to see what our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, could do. After defeating all the monsters, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, gave a smile to Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, and asked him if he was really going to keep his promise. Hours later, everyone was back at the institution, finishing the class for the day. Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, as a real instructor, at the end of that class let our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, know that, since he was exhausted for being his first class, he could go directly to his bedroom and rest a little. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, as he melted into his chair from sleep. In his head he was thinking why on earth the classes had to be so long. That was what encouraged him enough to get what he needed and get out of that institution as soon as possible. However, now that he thought about it, he never thought about teaching students. But then again, he had never been to school before either. At the time of departure, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, thought that although the class was boring as ever, he could get some information out of it, especially the story related to the constellation. In his previous life there was no such thing as a constellation, but still that intrigued him. And why not? Constellation was the term used to refer to the transformation of those who established great fortune into gods. Most constellations were involved with hunters as their sacred relics and granted them special powers. Our protagonist, the flying-kicking martial god, Kim Hyuno, had also learned that Valhalla in Korea was the third largest academy in the world with many constellation relics. But what he considered useless was everything related to swordplay and how to annihilate monsters. After going over all that in his head, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, decided to go to his dorm room and get serious about practicing martial arts because his body was really weak. But before even walking on, he ran into Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword. Unfortunately, in the next chapter, at the beginning, what we are shown is the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, drinking a cup of coffee, telling Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, that he had been through a lot. The two of them were in the teacher's room. There, Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, told the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, that everything that had happened, to be honest, was more of an embarrassment than a hardship, as he was really wondering if our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was really a simple high school student because he had made the 120 monsters in the virtual combat simulation room as he had been ordered to do. But our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, had killed them all. The old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, was disconnected for a moment. But when he came back to reality, he asked Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, if he was telling the truth. Furthermore, the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, asked aloud if even our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, had met a monster in his life. Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, let the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, know that that was what he was trying to tell him. However, the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, pointed out that there was nothing special about our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, unless they included that in his personal file it said he was an orphan, and that he had come from a small orphanage in a highly dangerous area. Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, found that strange, so he asked the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, if our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was a counterfeiter. The old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, replied, on the other hand, that he had already done his own research related to that and found out that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, was in fact not a forger, as a forger would not try to enter Valhalla and then make a complete fuss at the entrance ceremony. That, Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, calmed him down a bit, until the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, asked him if all our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, wanted was to enter the constellation room. There, Kim Ligon, the head instructor of Valhalla, let him know that that was what he wanted, which the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, let him know that after the first semester our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyuno, could enter there eventually, but if he had asked the director, he would let him enter the second floor of the basement. Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, thanked the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, for that, which the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, informed him that he was the one who had left him in that academy. Therefore, he should take as much responsibility as possible. Besides, the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, did not know about the fully restricted area on the 5th floor. But anyone could enter the 2nd floor, so there would be no problem if Kim Ligon, Valhalla's chief instructor, would be a little faster. Kim Ligon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, let that pass, but after a comfortable silence, he let the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, know that he was worried about what was going to happen in the next year. There, the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, asked him if his concern was for our main character, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, which Kim Lee-gon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, did not deny, but added that even if he did not take care of our main character, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, in his class there were also 3 students from the 5 families, therefore it was not easy to control any of them. The old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, understood where he wanted to go, so he told him that he wasn't trying to comfort him. But there was an exchange student from the Ventric family in the other classes. That made Kim Lee-gon, Valhalla's head instructor, quite surprised. The old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, explained to him that Rockdale Ventric had been kicked out of the British Academy for causing too much trouble. So Kim Lee-gon, Valhalla's chief instructor, relaxed a little more since his situation wasn't that bad. Moving on to the next scene, we finally meet again our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh. We had lingered on the scene from the previous chapter where he had met Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword. That's where our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, asked him what he wanted, to which Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, sorrowfully let him know that she wanted him to teach her swordplay. Now, in the next chapter we can see our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, quite confused by what Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, had asked him. But she still did not miss the opportunity and asked him that the sword handling that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had shown in the first class, wanted him to teach her. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, without even stopping to think about it, made it very clear that he was not going to do it. There, Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, asked him why he wouldn't do it, to which our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, replied because he simply didn't want to do it, and since she had nothing to say to him, he was leaving. Unfortunately for our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, did not give up easily, so he again asked her to teach him swordplay, to which our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, again said no, adding if anything happened to his ears. He asked him to leave him alone as he had no intention of teaching him anything. That said, he left her alone. The next morning we are shown our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, sitting in the back row of the classroom, thinking that the body where he lived was worse than expected because he could not even do martial arts training or whatever because he had no magical power. Plus it was very difficult to control the mana. But the problem of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, could be solved if he found that thing that was in the constellation room. The thoughts of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, were interrupted when someone called his name and stood in front of him. It turned out to be 2 people. One was Rockdale Ventric, who was from the main Ventric family, and the one accompanying him was his personal assistant, Uriah de Felix. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was confused, so he asked the blonde boy who he was, to which he thought it was to be expected that he was uneducated since our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, didn't even know the Ventric family. Still, the blonde boy introduced himself and let our protagonist, the flying martial god of kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, know bluntly that if he wanted to be strong. Now, to explain where this is going, it turns out that in most families, the secondary family line had a much harder time gaining power and wealth than the main line. However, the Ventric family had a peak mask who was a constellation guardian, so that made the Ventric family different from the others. Normally there was a constellation guardian of class or higher who protected the family and directly selected the constellation member to give them protection and strength. But for the Ventric family they chose to sign the contract with a non-constellation family member. That was a way for the chosen person to have a contract with the constellation without disagreement. And because of that unique choice, the Ventric family had a lot of power around Europe and in Europe itself. If our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was a member of the Ventric family, he could select a contractor regardless of his lineage. Therefore, the secondary family line could have as much power as the main family line. But on the other hand, Rockdale Ventric, who was so authoritatively supported by his family, had become too arrogant, so not long ago due to the commotion in the British Academy, the boy ended up being expelled. While the blonde boy was thinking that everything was more than perfect and it was no use crying over spilled milk, he watched the girl who would be his future assistant. Even though he had been kicked out before, he was from the Ventric family, so he always had a way to get back on track. According to him, the first thing he would do was to put our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, who was in the spotlight at the entrance of the ceremony, next to him. Back to the present, the blonde guy, with a smile, let our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, know that if he was under the blonde guy, he would take him to his family's constellation. He could have continued with his speech, but our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, interrupted him by telling him idiot. The blonde boy almost died, and Felix's Yuria was quite shocked at what he had said. Even so, Rockdil, the blonde boy, asked our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, to repeat everything he had just said. There, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, told him that he was not going to accept his offer since he was not stupid. He added that Rockdil, the blonde guy, had not been interested in him and was just showing off from the beginning. Therefore, since he said stupid things like that, he was an idiot. Rockdil, the blonde boy, with his blood boiling, told our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, that he was a filthy brat with no education whatsoever. But when he was about to continue insulting him, someone ordered him, by his full name, to take his seat. That annoyed Rockdil, the blonde boy, even more, so he annoyedly asked the one who had given the order if he had really told him his full name. It turned out that it had been the old senior instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol. He was standing in the very center of that classroom. Seeing Rockdil made it clear to him that that place was not the British Academy, but Valhalla, so the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, didn't care how big his family was. The blonde boy had to obey the instructors there. Rockdil, the blonde boy, upon seeing the old high-ranking instructor with long white hair, Lee Sang-cheol, thought if he really was the combat instructor of Valhalla. But annoyed, he walked out of class, letting our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, know that they were going to meet much faster than he expected. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, didn't mind. So moments after the blonde boy walked out, class began. Hours later, everyone was coming out of their classes. There again stood our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, thinking about how he hadn't gotten anything related to the constellation room that day, and that instead, he had gotten involved with an idiot in the morning. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, now knew that the Guild Scouts were a group of outsiders who came to the school to use the students and instructors to explore it. So he wondered if it wasn't enough on his part to badmouth them. He didn't finish thinking about it because once again there was Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, asking him, in the same place as the day before, to teach her how to handle the sword. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, upon seeing her, let her know, stressed, if everything she had told him the day before had not been enough for her either. But, before Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword answered our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, in the next scene we find ourselves in Valhalla's dormitory, to be exact in the upper classroom. There was the blonde boy smashing everything in that room, upset because our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had humiliated him in front of the whole class. The blonde boy could not believe how our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, being an orphan, had dared to do so much. He was sparking. Literally, the blonde boy saw our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, in his mind in red. Leaving everything shattered, he reluctantly ordered Yuria to call Desira, as he had to try to make our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, respect him. As Yuria, or well, Yuri as the blonde boy called her, didn't answer, he called her back, and as she didn't answer again, the blonde boy lost his temper and grabbed her by the hair, pulling it. He ordered her to answer him, but when she still didn't, he asked her if she really still thought she was the eldest daughter of the palace family. Yuri didn't answer either, which made the blonde boy pull her hair more, and then asked her if she wanted him to kick her out of her family. That scared her, causing her to finally speak up, asking him not to. The blonde boy, pleased with her answer, pulled her to the floor, making her basically kiss the ground. The blonde boy, looking at her with disgust, told her again to call Desira, and that there was also a son of the Rise family in 2nd grade. Therefore she had to tell him that the blonde boy wanted to see him. Yuri let it be known that she understood her order, but before we were shown more, we returned to our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh. He was in his room in the Valhalla dormitory, sitting on his bed trying to pull out some magic. How could he not? Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, said out loud that his real body was trash. That said, he recalled his talk with Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword. At last we can see how Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, followed our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, to the front of the dormitories. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, lost his patience and asked her where she was going to follow him. Arhin, the girl with the blue-white lightning sword, didn't say anything else other than she taught him the art of the sword. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, asked him if he was a parrot while thinking that Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, was really too annoying for his good. Therefore, he should get her to stay away. Thinking that he could make Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, disappear, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, made it clear to him that he had to pay 10 million won, as that was the cost of a lesson. Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, did not say anything, but started to look around. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, took it as a sign that she did not have such an amount. Thus he let her know that since she could not afford it, he was leaving. It was at that moment that Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, asked our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, to give her his cell phone. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, took out his phone rather confused. When he gave it to him, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, asked Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, what she wanted his cell phone for. Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, took his cell phone while telling him that she was putting his number so it would be easier for her to send him the money. That said, Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, gave the cell phone back to our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno. When our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, managed to see the notifications on his cell phone, it almost gave him something. Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, had transferred 100 million won to him. While Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, had her own cell phone in her hands, she delicately asked our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, if he was going to teach her how to use the sword. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, with a smile replied that no, he still wouldn't do it since he had refused to accept. Returning to his present, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, thought that Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, had surprised him earlier since he still didn't know how a student could send 100 million won. He also thought that if he deigned to teach that swordplay to Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword had to reveal all her secrets to him because what she had sent him was a good and large amount of money. Getting up from his bed, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, played it down as it was just money. Therefore, he could find it even if he had a beggar's amount of mana. Without further thought, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, got dressed and put a shovel in his backpack, determined to find his secret vault. Hours later, we have our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, walking out of Valhalla, thinking that before he went to that school, he had checked it in advance, but most of the notes that were hidden 1300 years ago were destroyed. Now, according to the research of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, there should be at least 4 notes, but most likely there were only 3 left, and most likely they were in the mountains of Valhalla. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, was quite determined to search for them. Thus, he adjusted his hood and released his mana. By doing that, the location of the notes could be determined by feeling the marble that responded to the magic of our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno. Thus, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, could feel it with the little magic he had. Hours later, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, could feel that he had found the place. When he arrived at the place, he took off his backpack and from it he took out the shovel like a serial killer and started digging. As soon as he put the shovel down hard, he complained about his weak body. Likewise, after complaining about our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, thought that if he had known that he was going to fight so hard, he would not have buried him in such a deep place. But, if it wasn't for the Tower of Destruction 1300 years ago, there would be no need for him to do that. In between digging and digging, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, kept thinking that the world was on the verge of destruction, and there was no place for his riches. Therefore, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, took notes and put them all in that place. He also wondered if the contents inside were still safe. Hours after so much digging, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyeno, seeing that the sun was rising, finally found the note. However, he struggled a bit to find the keyhole. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, let us know that a normal key would not fit in that keyhole. Therefore, he would have to make a thread of magic and shape it into a key. Once the magic thread was made and shaped into a key, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was quite happy to see that his key had gone in. Once the vault was opened, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, smiled and asked all his treasures if they had been more than fine. When our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, asked that, in the next scene we can see the amount of treasures he had there for years. In the next chapter, once our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, stood there, he thought that now that he had no worries about money, he could keep looking for what he really had to look for. Inspecting with his eyes, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was able to find his storage stones. That was what he really wanted to find in that vault. Taking them, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, thought that the time had come for him to use those stones since he had stored some magic in them 1300 years ago. Pulling out the magic from the storage stones, our protagonist, the flying kicking martial god, Kim Hyun-oh, got too excited as he felt the magic was overflowing in his body. Once ready, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, wondered whether he should leave the heavy gold ingots or take the light jewelry. Hours later, we can visualize our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, melting in his chair in class, thinking about how he really thought he would have to make a note in the future since he was a pretty crazy idiot. He also wondered if his muscles ached just because he got to do some digging or something else more. While our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was massaging his arms, out of nowhere appeared Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, delicately asking him for the umpteenth time to teach her the art of the sword. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, upon seeing her, let her know that he was not letting the matter go even because he was being paid. But as he said that, he thought that according to the information he had found when he reincarnated, among the 5 main families, the Chojin family, which included Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, was probably the family that practiced swordplay the most. So our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, did not understand why Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, was asking him to teach her such a thing. Without thinking, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, asked Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, what she was thinking, adding that she could learn more from her family. Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, denied that, letting him know that she wanted to learn from our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, not from someone else. Unsure, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, asked him again why, to which Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, replied that she had never seen anyone wield a better sword than our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh. Surprised but without showing it, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, asked Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, what was wrong with her father, since he was the head of that family. Therefore he must be better than him with the sword. Before Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, answered him, Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, arrived in the classroom and asked our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, to accompany him to his room. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, confusedly asked him why he should accompany him to that room. But Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, did not let him finish, as he cut him off by letting him know that if he followed him he might know what our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had asked him about last time. That was all it took for Kim Hyun-oh, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, to get up from his seat, determined to accompany him. Passing Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword just walked towards the exit. But when Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, asked her to wait a bit, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, let her know that he would have to be at the training grounds at 6 in the morning. Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, was speechless at what our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, had told her, so he had to turn around with a smile to ask her if that was what she wanted. Quickly Arhin, the girl with the blue and white lightning sword, replied that she was going to be there. Back in the teacher's room, Kim Legon, the head instructor of Valhalla, told our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, that he had a quick class, so he was going to try to talk fast. That said, he began to tell him that first of all, our protagonist, the martial flying kicking god, Kim Hyun-oh, had been approved to enter the constellation room, but he would only have to go to the basement floor. It was there that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, looked confused, so Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, let him know that he was not allowed to enter any floor lower than the first floor. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, let it be known that he understood, then asked him when he could go to the room. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, told him that if it was possible for our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, could be that very night, if it was okay with him. Without much thought, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, agreed. That's when Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, was surprised and thought that our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was not going to make it easy for him for not being able to go down to the second floor. But he just accepted without further ado. However, Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, concluded his thoughts by letting our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, know that they were going to get going. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, agreed with a smile. When night came, Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, let our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, know that they had arrived at the place. That was the treasure of Valhalla Academy, the Constellation Room. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, began to visualize every part of that place. And when he finished observing everything, he told Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, that the security there was tighter than at the main gate itself. And that was true. There were security guards everywhere, watching every move. Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, pointed out to our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, that the Constellation Room was that important. That room was important enough to make Valhalla one of the 3 great academies. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, thought that not only the security, but the outer walls were completely covered with all kinds of magic. Everything was completely surrounded except for the entrance. Noticing that, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, asked Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, how to get down to the second floor, adding that if he did so, he would have to become a criminal. There, sweating, Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, replied that he didn't have to become a criminal, but he would be completely expelled, plus he would lose his mind even before he left the school. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, did not quite understand that. Therefore, Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, explained to him that on the second floor the magic power of the constellation was running rampant. So if our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, were to touch that magic, his mind would break and drive him completely insane. Our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, repeated the words expulsion and mad, understanding what Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, was trying to tell him. Yet Kim Legon, the chief instructor of Valhalla, thought why our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, was asking him such a question just before entering. He added that, after thinking it over, our protagonist, the martial god of flying kicks, Kim Hyun-oh, being the first place entry candidate, would never do that.